What happens when an empire that claims to be the guardian of civilization quietly becomes the stage for its most twisted corruptions? Picture the Byzantine court, shimmering with gold and incense, yet hiding a labyrinth of cruelty, manipulation, and unspeakable abuses that rarely reach the pages of official chronicles. This world was ruled not by justice or divine order, but by elites who treated power as a personal weapon, bending the empire itself to their darkest impulses. As you enter this narrative, imagine walking through those echoing marble halls where whispers of betrayal were more dangerous than swords, and where every smile carried the weight of a hidden threat. The Byzantine elite perfected the art of corruption in ways that defy belief today. Behind grand ceremonies and religious devotion, they orchestrated acts that pushed human morality to its breaking point. These were individuals who controlled armies, dictated the fate of cities, and used laws as tools to shield their own brutality. Their power was not merely political, it seeped into every corner of society, shaping a world where fear was more reliable than loyalty, and where cruelty often masqueraded as order. You might wonder how far a ruling class could go before the structure beneath them began to fracture, and what hidden atrocities they allowed themselves when they believed no one would dare to expose them. This story begins where official records fall silent and where the truth was buried. Beneath layers of propaganda, forged alliances, and carefully crafted myths. To understand the empire these elites created, you need to see the moments they tried hardest to erase, the punishments they inflicted to maintain their dominance, and the brutal decisions that defined the lives of countless ordinary people who had no voice in the glittering palaces that controlled their fate. As you follow this path through the shadows of Byzantine history, you might find yourself questioning not only the empire, but the very nature of power when it slips beyond accountability and becomes a force shaped solely by desire and ambition. You ever felt that strange mix of curiosity and discomfort when realizing that truth is often uglier than the legend built around it? If this begins to stir something in you, share your thoughts in the comments. You already understand the value of digging into what lies beneath the surface, so make sure to leave a like and check whether you are subscribed to the channel. What you will uncover next may challenge everything you imagined about imperial corruption, and it leads us deeper into the shadows where the next layer of this story waits to be revealed. The deeper you move into the hidden machinery of Byzantine power, the more you begin to see how the empire was not merely governed, but engineered through networks of wealth that operated behind the shimmering facade of imperial authority. Gold was the true bloodstream of the empire, and those who controlled its flow did not just accumulate riches. They crafted an alternate reality where loyalty could be bought, enemies could be dismantled without a blade being drawn, and the fate of entire provinces could shift with a single whispered transaction. To understand how corruption reached such an outrageous scale, you must picture the elite not as administrators, but as architects of manipulation, using economic leverage as their most precise and devastating weapon. Within the elite circles, alliances were rarely sincere. They were forged through bribes disguised as gifts, tributes framed as acts of devotion, and secret payments that passed between hands under the cover of night. These exchanges were not mere transactions but strategies, shaping the empire through invisible pressures that rarely left traces in official ledgers. Those who mastered this system learned to control generals, influence religious leaders, and even sway the emperors themselves. Some rose to unimaginable power by orchestrating silent coups where coins mattered more than steel, and betrayals were arranged across lavish banquets or private meetings sealed by promises no one intended to keep. The manipulation of wealth extended far beyond the palace. Provincial governors who resisted the demands of these influential figures often found themselves crushed under fabricated accusations or replaced by rivals who owed their positions to shadowy patrons rather than imperial competence. Taxation became a battlefield where ordinary citizens suffered the consequences of elite greed as heavy burdens were imposed not to support the state but to fuel private schemes. Entire communities learned that justice depended less on law and more on who had the means to twist the system in their favor, creating an atmosphere where the empire itself felt like a living organism infected by the ambitions of a few who believed they stood above consequence. Even religious institutions, ostensibly the moral backbone of the empire, were woven into this web of silent corruption. Donations to monasteries and churches often served as disguised bribes, granting access to political influence or securing forgiveness for crimes that would have condemned lesser men. Clerics found themselves entangled in the elite game, navigating a world where spiritual authority could be weaponized to legitimize the most audacious abuses of power. Through these layers of manipulation, the elites refined a system so complex and pervasive that it became impossible to separate the empire's official mechanisms from the personal ambitions of those who dominated them. As this hidden economy of treachery expanded, it shaped a culture where deception was expected, where trust was fleeting, and where the value of a man was measured not by virtue, but by his influence over the invisible flows of wealth that dictated the empire's course. And within this world of silent transactions and calculated betrayals, a new form of corruption began to take shape, one that would blur the boundaries between law and cruelty, reshaping the empire from within as we move deeper into its darkest layers. As you descend further into the political core of the Byzantine world, the true horror of elite corruption begins to reveal itself not only through manipulation, but through the deliberate reshaping of justice. The law, which should have been a shield for the weak, became instead a flexible instrument molded by the powerful to protect their interests and destroy their rivals. In this environment, legality and cruelty merged in ways that allowed the elites to perform acts so extreme that the common people could barely comprehend them. With every new manipulation of the legal system, the boundaries between governance and brutality blurred until they were almost indistinguishable. This twisting of justice often began with subtle alterations of imperial decrees, crafted in language that appeared righteous while hiding clauses designed for personal gain. Those who had access to the imperial court could influence punishments, overturn convictions, or orchestrate false charges simply by navigating the labyrinth of bureaucratic privilege. It was common for officials to weaponize accusations of treason, heresy, or embezzlement against those who threatened their influence. Such charges carried severe consequences, and the accused rarely had the means to defend themselves against an elite class that controlled both judges and executioners. The spectacle of justice became a performance, staged to legitimize decisions already made in private chambers dripping with political ambition. The punishments inflicted under this system exposed the darker instincts of the ruling class. Floggings, forced amputations, blinding and imprisonment in dank underground cells were imposed selectively, not as measures of order, but as tools of intimidation. Even more disturbing were the secret punishments the IG chronicles barely mention, carried out in isolated rooms far from public view. Those targeted by the elite found themselves subjected to cruelty designed not only to break the body, but to erase any trace of dissent. The brutality served a purpose. It reminded everyone, from provincial administrators to minor nobles, that challenging the elite meant risking a fate crafted to instill terror rather than uphold law. At the same time, criminals who served the interests of the elite were often shielded from punishment, embezzlers who funneled wealth to powerful patrons, spies who undermined political opponents, and informants who fed palace factions were granted protection and sometimes even elevated to positions of authority. The hypocrisy of this selective justice bred resentment among the population, who lived with the constant awareness that justice was not blind, but deeply compromised. For many, punishment depended not on guilt, but on proximity to power, turning the empire into a stage where morality was negotiable and cruelty was currency. Religious law, too, was manipulated to reinforce this system. Confessors and clerics aligned with influential families could absolve the elite of grave sins, while condemning political adversaries under the guise of spiritual correction. This merging of sacred authority with political ambition allowed ruling figures to cloak their brutality in divine legitimacy. The result was a society where fear governed more effectively than decree, and where the population learned that mercy was reserved for those who could afford it, while the powerless were left to navigate a world twisted by the ambitions of the untouchable elite. Through these distortions of justice, the Byzantine rulers created an empire sustained by intimidation, where the law became an extension of their will and cruelty served as a structured language of control. Yet, as horrifying as this manipulation of justice was, it was only one layer of a much deeper shadow. Within the next realm of corruption, the secrets become even darker as scandal after scandal was buried beneath the empire's gilded surface, shaping events that official records tried desperately to conceal. When you peer behind the official façade of Byzantine stability, you find an empire held together not only by strategy and administration, but by the meticulous concealment of scandals that could have shattered its image. These weren't minor indiscretions or political mishaps. They were monumental abuses, orchestrated by individuals whose influence reached far beyond the palace walls. The elite understood that their power depended on maintaining the illusion of divine order, so they perfected the art of erasure, ensuring that the most incriminating episodes of corruption never reached the chronicles, or if they did, appeared only as cryptic traces stripped of their true weight. What survived was a sanitized shadow of events so shocking that even seasoned historians struggle to unravel the truth today. At the heart of these buried scandals were acts that blurred the line between personal ambition and state collapse. High-ranking officials engaged in conspiracies that sabotaged military campaigns, redirected public funds meant for famine relief, and manipulated imperial successions in exchange for wealth and influence. Each scandal had the potential to ignite unrest or weaken frontier defenses, yet the elites who orchestrated them remained untouchable. They controlled the scribes who documented history, the informants who filtered information, and the investigators who were expected to uphold imperial integrity. With every secret covered, the empire drifted further from accountability, creating a silent underworld, where corruption shaped decisions that affected millions. Some of the most outrageous episodes involved covert negotiations with foreign enemies, in which Byzantine nobles traded military secrets or political access for personal advantage. These deals, if exposed, could have branded them as traitors, yet they were expertly concealed behind diplomatic misdirection. Other scandals revolved around exploitative taxation schemes that enriched the elite while devastating entire regions. Complaints from citizens rarely reached the emperor intact. By the time they passed through layers of corrupt intermediaries, they had been diluted or transformed into praise. In this carefully controlled environment, truth had to fight its way through a labyrinth deliberately designed to smother it. Even the imperial family itself was not immune to scandal. Rival factions within the palace manipulated marriages, births, and deaths to reshape the line of succession. Rumors of poisoning, Fabricated prophecies and forged decrees circulated behind closed doors, fueling a hidden war that determined who would sit on the throne. These were not isolated incidents, but patterns repeated across generations, each scandal deepening the culture of secrecy that allowed the elite to operate with impunity. To the public, the empire appeared guided by divine providence. In reality, it was held together by whispered agreements, bribes disguised as tributes, and a network of conspirators skilled in destroying evidence before it ever surfaced. The impact of these silenced scandals extended far beyond the individuals involved. They influenced military strategies, economic stability, and diplomatic relations. The empire's most catastrophic failures often had roots in corruption so well hidden that only fragments remain today. When we examine these rare traces, we begin to see how much of Byzantine history was shaped not by grand reforms or heroic emperors, but by the self-serving decisions of those who thrived in the shadows. If any of this sparks a thought or reminds you of how power often hides its truest face, share your perspective in the comments. Your voice adds depth to this journey through what the chronicles dared not reveal, and it helps illuminate the unseen forces that shaped an empire built as much on secrecy as on stone. The deeper you travel into the hidden chambers of Byzantine influence, the clearer it becomes that the empire was shaped as much by what was never written as by what survived in official records. Behind the ornate curtains of the imperial residence, far from the rituals and public ceremonies that projected stability, palace conspiracies unfolded with a precision that only those bred inside the political labyrinth could master. These secret conflicts were not spontaneous acts of ambition, but carefully choreographed campaigns of manipulation, executed by individuals who understood that true power depended on remaining invisible. The chronicles mention the outcomes, the sudden dismissals or unexplained deaths, but the forces that produced them often remain buried beneath layers of silence. At the center of many of these covert struggles were competing factions that weaponized influence like a blade. Eunuchs with unparalleled access to the emperor wielded whispers as effectively as soldiers wielded spears. Empresses and imperial relatives forged alliances through discreet negotiations, leveraging marriage prospects, dowries, and reputations to tilt the balance of the palace. Ambitious generals stationed at distant frontiers exchanged coded messages with court insiders, seeking opportunities to elevate themselves by destabilizing a rival's standing. These networks operated in parallel, constantly shifting, constantly recalibrating, each maneuver designed to appear accidental, each betrayal staged to seem unavoidable. What made these conspiracies so dangerous was not only their secrecy, but their ability to alter the empire's trajectory without leaving a trace. A forged document placed at the right desk could redirect military reinforcements from one province to another, setting the stage for a catastrophic defeat. A strategically timed rumor whispered to the emperor could end a political career overnight. Food tasters, scribes, astrologers, and personal attendants, roles that seemed trivial to outsiders, were essential components in a system where information could be deadlier than poison. A single intercepted message or a misinterpreted omen could ignite a chain reaction that toppled individuals who never saw the threat approaching. Some conspiracies reached such complexity that even those involved struggled to keep track of their own threads. Agents were sent to infiltrate rival circles, only to be seduced into shifting loyalties. Payments disappeared, bribes were redirected, and forged accusations were passed through intermediaries to obscure their origin. What the people witnessed were abrupt shifts in authority, unexplained imprisonments, or hurried banishments, yet they rarely grasped the invisible mechanisms behind these events. The palace became a living organism with multiple beating hearts, each one pushing against the others, creating an atmosphere where trust was almost impossible and paranoia was a constant companion. These shadow conflicts could erupt with destructive force when factions sought to control imperial succession. If an emperor appeared weak, ill, or indecisive, ambitious courtiers moved swiftly to secure influence over the heir or to endorse an alternative claimant. Political marriages were undone, alliances were severed, and long-standing loyalties dissolved as contenders sought advantage in an arena where a single misjudgment could result in exile or death. The empire's stability depended less on formal institutions and more on the delicate equilibrium between these rival powers, a balance that could collapse with astonishing speed when conspirators overplayed their hand. Yet despite the danger that surrounded every move, these hidden battles continued generation after generation, shaping policies, wars, and internal reforms from behind the scenes. And, as the shadows grew deeper, a new layer of corruption emerged, one driven not merely by ambition, but by a brutality that seeped into the very fabric of imperial life, waiting to reveal itself in forms far more disturbing than political intrigue. As you move further into the heart of Byzantium's hidden world, a chilling realization begins to emerge. The elite did not simply build a system of corruption. They constructed a machine so vast and self-sustaining that it eventually turned against those who had engineered it. What began as a network of influence designed to consolidate authority transformed into a living entity with its own momentum, capable of consuming anyone who failed to keep pace with its demands. Every bribe, every betrayal, every manipulation fed this mechanism, tightening its grip on the empire until the boundaries between survival and complicity blurred beyond recognition. In this environment, even the most powerful figures lived in constant fear of becoming victims of the very system they once controlled. The machine operated through an intricate web of dependencies. High-ranking officials maintained their positions not through competence or loyalty, but through the debts they owed to others. Favor begot favor, obligation bred obligation, and soon the entire political structure resembled a chain of mutual blackmail. A single exposed secret could unravel an entire hierarchy, so corruption became both the foundation and the glue that kept the elite bound to one another. The system demanded ever-increasing participation, forcing individuals to commit acts they would have once considered unthinkable, simply to retain their standing. To refuse was to invite isolation, and in the Byzantine court, isolation often led to ruin. As the machine expanded, it grew unpredictable. A minor official who once served as a pawn might suddenly rise to power by exploiting a weakness in his patron's network. A trusted ally could transform into a dangerous liability if circumstances shifted. Records were altered, testimonies were coerced, and new layers of secrecy were added to hide the tracks of earlier conspiracies. No one could ever be confident that past actions would remain buried, and this uncertainty fueled an atmosphere where preemptive strikes became common. Eliminating a potential threat before it emerged as one was considered not only prudent but necessary, leading to a cycle of internal purges disguised as administrative reforms or moral corrections. The psychological toll on the elite was immense. Many lived double lives, the public face of calm, ceremonial authority and the private face of relentless strategizing driven by fear of betrayal. Late-night meetings, coded letters, and secret alliances consumed their existence, turning every interaction into a negotiation. Paranoia became a survival skill. Even family bonds were corrupted by the machine, as siblings, spouses, and cousins were drawn into competing networks of influence. A misinterpreted gesture or an overheard whisper could ignite suspicion, and suspicion often escalated into catastrophic action. In this climate, loyalty was fragile, trust was a luxury, and power was both a prize and a curse. The machine did not merely control political life, it seeped into social and cultural structures. Artists, scholars and merchants found themselves entangled in elite conflicts, whether they wished to be or not. A craftsman's prosperity might hinge on the favor of a patron entangled in a distant conspiracy. A scholar's manuscript could influence political perceptions and thus become a tool in factional warfare. Even religious leaders were not immune, as their credibility was frequently leveraged to legitimize power plays within the palace. The entire empire became a stage where corruption dictated roles, and no one remained untouched by its reach. Yet, for all its consuming power, the machine retained one fatal flaw. It relied on constant expansion to sustain itself. Each generation of elites inherited a system more complex and volatile than the last, forcing them into increasingly desperate measures to maintain equilibrium. And as this escalating cycle tightened its grip on the empire, the brutality that lurked beneath the surface began to manifest in ways more visceral and terrifying than political maneuvering alone, drawing the empire toward acts that even hardened chroniclers hesitated to describe. As the Byzantine corruption machine grew more ravenous, its violence became less metaphorical and more literal, emerging in acts so disturbing that even seasoned chroniclers hesitated to record them. Beneath the empire's ornate religious imagery and solemn public ceremonies, a darker reality pulsed in hidden rooms, remote fortresses, and heavily guarded chambers where the elite enacted forms of punishment and intimidation that defied both legal norms and human restraint. These brutalities were not random explosions of cruelty, but calculated performances meant to reinforce the fear that held the empire together. For the ruling class, terror was not a byproduct of power. It was a deliberate tool of governance. Among the most shocking abuses were those carried out against individuals who threatened the delicate balance of palace politics. Rivals were seized at night and subjected to tortures disguised as lawful interrogations. Blinding, the empire's signature punishment became a symbolic weapon used to eliminate political contenders while avoiding outright execution. Some victims endured mutilations intended not only to remove them from public life, but to send a chilling message to anyone considering resistance. In the darkest accounts, prisoners were confined to subterranean cells, where starvation, darkness, and psychological torment slowly dismantled their will. These methods were whispered about, but rarely documented, for scribes knew the consequences of revealing too much. There were also more insidious forms of brutality disguised as moral correction, accusations of immorality or heresy, often fabricated by political rivals, led to forced confessions extracted through elaborate torment. Elite factions used religious rhetoric as a veil to justify punishments that served purely political ends. Behind the walls of monasteries and ecclesiastical courts, individuals suffered for crimes they never committed, caught between the ambitions of rival clerics and secular power brokers. The intertwining of spiritual authority and political cruelty created an environment where suffering could be sanctified, leaving victims with no recourse and no audience for their cries. Even within the imperial family, cruelty drifted like a shadow. Brothers turned on brothers, mothers plotted against sons, and heirs were disfigured or imprisoned to secure the ambitions of a single faction. Some emperors ordered punishments so extreme that later historians struggled to distinguish fact from legend. These accounts, though fragmented, reveal a pattern. The Byzantine elite believed that control was not merely preserved through strategy, but through the spectacle of dominance, through acts meant to shock, silence, and reshape the consciousness of all who witnessed or heard about them. Power became a theater of fear, and brutality its most compelling script. Outside the palace, the impact of elite cruelty seeped into everyday life. Provincial governors, emboldened by the examples set in the capital, administered punishments that exceeded legal boundaries. Entire communities suffered collective reprisals for resistance or administrative failures. Soldiers were deployed not only for defense, but for punishment, transforming villages into cautionary displays meant to reinforce obedience. In these moments, the empire's grandeur felt like a distant illusion, overshadowed by the harsh reality enforced by those who believed themselves untouchable. All of these hidden brutalities formed an essential dimension of Byzantine corruption, revealing how power warped into cruelty when shielded from scrutiny. If any part of this unsettles you or sparks a perspective you want to share, leave your thoughts in the comments. Your reflections help illuminate these shadowed corners of history and deepen our journey into the empire's most obscure truths. As the brutality of the Byzantine elite deepened, it intertwined seamlessly with another defining characteristic of imperial corruption. And an appetite for luxury so extravagant that it seemed to mock the suffering it created. While chronicles often celebrated the splendor of the imperial court, they remained silent about the human cost underlying its magnificence. Every jewel, every silk tapestry, every ceremonial feast reflected not prosperity, but the extraction of wealth from a population trapped beneath an increasingly oppressive system. The elite convinced themselves that their lavish lifestyle signified divine favor, yet its true foundation lay in exploitation so pervasive that it shaped the empire's social fabric from the ground up. The imperial palace operated as a world apart, an opulent bubble insulated from the desperation spreading through the provinces. Courtiers hosted banquets where rare spices, foreign wines, and decadent dishes flowed freely, even in times of famine. Artisans were commanded to produce works of staggering beauty with no regard for their own survival, and entire workshops were driven to exhaustion to satisfy the whims of patrons obsessed with displaying their superiority. The palace corridors glittered with gold mosaics and embroidered fabrics that concealed an economic structure draining communities, forcing families into debt, and leaving countless citizens at the mercy of local administrators seeking to impress their superiors with increased tribute. Beneath this glittering veneer, exploitation took many forms. Tax collectors, emboldened by distant overseers, imposed levies that far exceeded legal limits, knowing that protesting such abuses was futile. Poor farmers often relinquished not only their harvests, but their lands, their livestock, or their labor, transforming free citizens into dependents bound to the estates of powerful individuals. Those who could not meet impossible demands faced confiscation, imprisonment, or the quiet ruin of their livelihoods. The empire's infrastructure, once a source of pride, deteriorated as resources flowed upward into elite pockets rather than being reinvested into roads, fortifications, or public welfare. Urban centers suffered too. Merchants struggled against monopolies granted to court favorites, who manipulated markets to enrich themselves while driving competitors into destitution. Craftsmen found their guilds infiltrated by individuals who owed their positions not to skill, but to connections. The economic pressure suffocated innovation and stability, turning vibrant communities into shadows of their former selves. Even charity, a cornerstone of Byzantine religious life, became entangled in elite corruption. Donations intended to support hospitals, orphanages, and monasteries were diverted, reduced, or used to disguise illicit dealings. The institutions meant to provide relief became unwilling participants in a system designed to elevate the few at any cost. The psychological divide between rulers and subjects grew wider with each generation. While the elite wrapped themselves in silk and ceremony, the population learned to navigate a world where survival depended on avoiding notice, appeasing local authorities, or accepting forms of labor that offered little hope of advancement. Resentment simmered beneath the surface, but open resistance was rare, suppressed by both fear and the belief that imperial grandeur was permanent ordained and unchangeable. In reality, each layer of luxury added weight to a structure that was beginning to decay from within, weakened by the very excesses meant to display its strength. This imbalance created an empire increasingly defined by contrast: breathtaking wealth towering above quiet misery, ceremonial dignity masking systemic exploitation, and imperial pride coexisting with the erosion of the social foundations that once sustained it. As these forces intensified, corruption ceased to be a hidden engine and became instead a visible, corrosive presence shaping every aspect of Byzantine life. And as the elites pushed their privileges further, the normalization of cruelty and excess edged the empire toward a point where even the most hardened insiders sensed that something fundamental was slipping out of their control. The further the Byzantine elite drifted into their insulated world of privilege, the more profoundly cruelty became woven into the logic of their daily existence. What had once been extraordinary acts of intimidation gradually evolved into routine measures, accepted not only as necessary tools of governance but as expected demonstrations of authority. Over time, this normalization of brutality shaped an elite culture in which empathy was viewed as weakness, restraint as risk, and moral hesitation as a liability that could invite political collapse. Those who rose to prominence did so by adapting to an environment where ruthless behavior was not merely tolerated, but quietly encouraged, forming an internal hierarchy built upon displays of controlled violence and calculated dominance. This shift manifested in subtle ways long before it erupted into visible abuses. Courtiers learned to speak in coded language that framed cruelty as administrative efficiency, describing purges as reforms, punishments as stabilizing measures, and coerced confessions as necessary clarifications. These euphemisms insulated the elite from the emotional impact of their decisions, allowing them to distance themselves from the suffering they orchestrated. As newcomers entered the political sphere, they found that conforming to these patterns was essential for survival. The education of future officials even incorporated case studies of past punishments and political eliminations, framing them as lessons in strategy rather than as ethical dilemmas. In this environment, the transition from observer to participant occurred almost seamlessly. What made the normalization especially dangerous was how it altered interpersonal dynamics within the elite circle. Instead of forming alliances based on trust or shared purpose, individuals gravitated toward relationships forged through mutual fear or strategic necessity. Demonstrations of cruelty became a method of establishing reliability. A faction leader who hesitated to act decisively risked losing followers to a rival who presented themselves as more capable of enforcing loyalty. Even acts of mercy acquired political meaning, interpreted as signals of weakness that could be exploited. In such a climate, cruelty was rewarded, refined, and transmitted across generations, becoming embedded in the culture of governance itself. Beyond the palace, this normalization trickled outward into the behavior of regional governors and military commanders. Many viewed the elite's conduct as a model, adopting harsh tactics to prove their allegiance or emulate the standards set by the capital. Villages experienced arbitrary punishments, soldiers faced brutal discipline, and conspiracies were met with responses far exceeding the severity of the offense. The empire's legal frameworks, already distorted by corruption, provided little protection against these excesses. What mattered was not justice, but demonstration of authority, and authority increasingly manifested in acts designed to instill fear rather than promote order. The societal consequences became visible in the shifting psychology of the population. As cruelty became more common, people grew desensitized to its presence in everyday life. Tales of executions, mutilations, and forced confessions no longer sparked the shock they once did. Instead, they blended into the rhythm of political existence, recounted with a sense of inevitability rather than outrage. Citizens internalized the idea that resisting the system was futile, that survival demanded silence and submission, and that cruelty was an unavoidable feature of imperial life. This resignation reinforced the power of the elite, allowing them to push boundaries even further without encountering meaningful opposition. Yet beneath this growing acceptance, an undercurrent of instability developed. The normalization of cruelty encouraged the elite to escalate their behavior, unaware that each new act strained the empire's foundations. A system built on fear could function only as long as it remained predictable, but as brutality became commonplace, its impact diminished, compelling the elite to intensify their actions to achieve the same effect. This accelerating cycle of cruelty and desensitization set the stage for a tipping point where the empire's internal logic would begin to fracture, drawing the Byzantine world closer to a reckoning it could no longer evade. By the time the Byzantine elite reached the height of their unchecked authority, the corruption that had once served their ambitions began to erode the very structures that supported them. The empire, long accustomed to shifting alliances and political games, could no longer absorb the escalating abuses that had become woven into its identity. Each act of cruelty, each manipulation of law, each diversion of wealth contributed to a cumulative decay that settled into the heart of the state like an unhealed wound. The people no longer saw their rulers as guardians of order, but as distant figures feeding on the empire's lifeblood. And this widening divide created the perfect conditions for instability to seep into every corner of Byzantine life. What unfolded was not a sudden collapse, but a slow suffocation driven by decades of decisions rooted in ambition rather than responsibility. This unraveling became most visible in the empire's weakened ability to respond to external threats. As elite factions turned inward, consumed by their own rivalries, military preparedness deteriorated. Resources meant for fortifications and armies were redirected into private estates, lavish ceremonies, and the maintenance of personal influence. Commanders appointed through favoritism lacked the strategic skill required to defend the borders, and soldiers, underpaid or exploited, lost their motivation to fight. Enemies who had once feared the Byzantine war machine found themselves facing a hollowed structure disguised by ceremonial grandeur. The very mechanisms that once ensured Byzantine resilience had been drained by a ruling class more focused on preserving personal power than safeguarding the realm. The internal fractures widened as corruption seeped into administrative layers meant to uphold stability. Governors pursued their own enrichment at the expense of the regions they supervised, creating pockets of deprivation that destabilized trade and agriculture. Courts became paralyzed by political interference, unable to enforce consistent justice. Communication between provinces and the capital broke down as intermediaries manipulated reports to suit the agendas of their patrons. In this environment, small crises grew into major catastrophes because no one could distinguish truth from fabrication, urgency from opportunism. The empire suffered not from a single fatal blow, but from the accumulation of countless smaller wounds inflicted by those entrusted to protect it. Even religion, long a source of unity, became entangled in the corruption that defined the age. As elite figures sought spiritual justification for their power, ecclesiastical disputes deepened, dividing communities and fueling tensions that further weakened the state. Doctrinal conflicts, once manageable, escalated into political battlegrounds, where theological positions aligned with personal ambitions rather than genuine belief. The moral authority of institutions that had once offered solace eroded as the public witnessed how easily sacred foundations could be twisted to reinforce the power of the few. The empire found itself spiritually fragmented at a time when cohesion was most desperately needed. Through all of this, the Byzantine elite remained convinced of their invincibility. They misinterpreted the empire's centuries of endurance as proof that it would withstand any burden, unaware that they had pushed its mechanisms to a breaking point. Corruption had ceased to be a hidden force guiding decisions from the shadows. It had become the dominant reality, shaping every aspect of governance. And as this reality deepened, Byzantine society began to sense that the ground beneath it was shifting, that the structures once believed unshakable were slowly cracking under the weight of decisions made by those who believed consequences were reserved only for others. If you stayed with this journey until now, your presence shows how deeply these forgotten layers of history still resonate. Share a comment saying, "This message was for me, so I know you reached the end of this exploration." If this narrative brought new insight, consider subscribing to continue uncovering hidden stories that shape the world, and feel free to leave a like to support the work behind these deep dives. There is another video waiting beside this one that expands these ideas in ways you may not expect, so step into the next chapter and continue this path with me as we explore what lies beyond the surface of history.